Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm John Peters. I'm a therapist who's been in practice for over 25 years, and I've worked with thousands of patients, as well as someone who's taught a full semester stress management course at Indiana University for 15 years to several thousand students. And this channel is about sharing a wide variety of wellness techniques to benefit everybody, right? So in this video, I'm going to talk about importance versus urgency, which is something your brain is not naturally wired to differentiate, but something that's one of the most important things that we can differentiate. Stay tuned. Okay, so in today's video, I am going to talk about importance versus urgency, right? And what I mean by this is that when we experience something and then we're responding to it, whether we think about this in very explicit terms, like I think that thing is pretty important, our brain is going to assign a level of importance, right? Low to high level of importance. But a related but different concept is how urgent something is. And urgency has to do with how quickly do I need to respond to the thing so that the outcome doesn't get worse. Okay? So, for example, if I get an electricity bill in the mail and it says you owe such and such, and if you don't pay by a certain date, then you're going to pay a late fee, right? That's what we call objective urgency, which means a reasonable person would look at that bill and say, yes, there is a level of urgency because there's this date. And it has, whatever the level of importance is in terms of paying it, it certainly has an objective aspect of urgency, right? Now, the problem with this is that not all things have objective urgency, and where we are in a calm state while we are assessing the urgency. So in the example I just gave, I look at my utility bill and I might not be particularly flipped out about it. Although recently, honestly, I'm filming this in very cold weather, and a lot of people in different parts of the United States have been having real emergency services relating to keeping their heat on and things like that. So you don't want to get your heat turned off in the middle of negative 30 wind chill temperatures, right? So that would be high importance, high urgency. But here's the thing. When we get triggered and we're having the stress response, we are actually wired to mash importance and urgency together and to not be able to see them as separate things, right? Unlike me here, let's say I'm in a calm state on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm at a 2, and I look at the mail and look at the utility bill and I see when the due date is. In that calm state, I can easily parse out, separate, make distinct the issue of urgency, the due date, and then see those as separate things, and I can gauge it as a level of importance, right? But when we are in a state where we are not at code green or code yellow, but we're up at code orange or code red on the stress scale, what happens is our brain is going to mash importance and urgency together, right? So take a look at this graph I'll put up on the screen now. So this is the importance urgency 2-axis graph, right? In the middle axis, we have at the top high importance and at the bottom low importance. And then we have across the horizontal axis low urgency to high urgency. Now, if we are in a calm state, we could sit down with such a graph and just plot out all the things that we need to focus on today or this week or whatever, right? And I could rate things with level of importance. I could also put them left to right in terms of level of urgency. However, when we're triggered and we're up at code orange, high orange, code red, our brain will automatically by default make us jump to the top right-hand quadrant of that graph, meaning high urgency and high importance. Our brains are just naturally wired to do that. And let me give you some history to say why our brains are wired to do that and why our brains are not wired to make that distinction, even though it would be a good idea, which I'll talk about later in terms of why it's a good idea. So I want to go back in time 500 million years, right? So in the history of the evolution of animals on the earth, we could actually start 600 million years ago, but the first 100 million years were pretty boring if we're looking at it from the standpoint of the evolution of what we now will call nervous systems. Because for the first 100 million years, multicellularity existed technically. First we have single cells, but then we have multicellularity where cells are starting to group. But for the first 100 million years, nothing interesting was happening in the archaeological record, at least that we can see. But starting 500 million years ago, cells started to organize in complex ways, leading eventually to cell specialization and organs, and leading to the structures that became nervous systems, and that went through hundreds of millions of years of evolution to eventually end up with what you and I inherit, which is the big complex human brain, right? And so the pressure for nervous systems and brains to become complex and structured the way they are and to perform the way they are had to do with predation mostly. So basically, organisms were trying to not get eaten. And the stress response, which I'm going to talk in another video a little more richly about all the different aspects of the stress response. But the stress response basically is the nervous system recognizing a threat and then causing a variety of complex internal changes in the organism so that the organism can survive that threat and not die, right? But here's the thing. There's no good evidence that our ancestors knew about time until fairly recently. And I'm going to say what fairly recently is. But for hundreds of millions of years, you had these real-time, extremely important threats that were also extremely urgent because they were life or death threats that had to do with basically getting killed and eaten from one second to the next, right? There were no situations in that long, hundreds of millions of years long history that would have been the type that where the organism would see it as extremely important, but not simultaneously extremely urgent, right? So if I'm getting chased by a giant bear, I'm getting chased by a saber-toothed tiger, that is high importance and high urgency, right? Nobody's going to quibble with that. If we had, organisms with our ancestors sitting there thinking, oh, it's a giant bear, probably no big deal, I can wait and deal with it later, all those organisms and animals got eaten by giant bears, and thus they didn't pass on their genes to us. Our ancestors were the ones who saw the giant bear and reacted as though it was high importance and high urgency. So over and over in countless times where this was crucial, high importance also meant high urgency. And those two concepts in terms of the brain perception and reaction were not made distinct. They were the same thing, right? And that was true for hundreds of millions of years. And the context in which it has more recently become important is the current social context where a lot of the threats that we face, meaning things that trigger us to have the stress response, are social and conceptual kinds of threats. They are not life or death physical threats, right? Few of us these days are getting chased by giant bears and saber-toothed tigers. In fact, if you think about it, so here's something I used to do actually to make this point. When I was teaching the stress management class, I had pretty big classes, so I might even have a big class with like 100 students in it. And when I was giving this lecture talking about this concept, I would say to everybody, get out a sheet of paper, number it 1 to 3. And without thinking and editing and filtering too much, I just want you to think of the last 3 things that triggered you that you got stressed out about. So you write 3 things down. So then I would say to the 100 students, each of which having written just 3 things, right? I would say, don't tell me what they are necessarily, but I want you to raise your hand if at least one of your 3 things was a physical threat, where you had to physically save yourself from a physical threat, right? Usually in a group of 100 students, I would have maybe 1, sometimes 2 that would raise their hand with one of their 3 stress triggers being a physical threat. This meant that of the 300 things that the 100 students wrote down, like 299 of them were non-physical threats, right? And that meant that my students, like me, like you, most of the time when we get triggered and we're having the stress response, we're not in physical danger, right? Now, I'm not poo-pooing the situations of physical danger because they exist. But I'm just saying that 99.99% of the time, we have this stress response. It's not one where we are in physical danger, and yet our brain is reacting as though there is physical danger, which means our brain is instantly turning importance up to 11, but also urgency up to 11. So back with my chart, we're jumping to the top right quadrant in the chart, high importance, high urgency. But some things might be very important, but not very urgent. This only really became a distinct aspect of the types of stressors that we were facing after the advent of agriculture, which happened after the end of the last ice age. So the end of the last ice age was like 10,000 years ago. Agriculture got under full steam something like 5,000 years ago. So basically now you and I live in a social environment, a physical environment, cultural environment where some of the time we do sit and watch corn grow. That did not happen prior to the end of the last ice age and the advent of agriculture, right? And so just in thinking conceptually about non-physical threats, stress triggers really have a lot to do with our complex social identities and complex social organization. That was dependent on agriculture because you couldn't have large cities with lots of role specialization within those societal structures until you had the agriculture to exploit the natural resources to support the dense city populations, right? Those didn't exist prior to the end of the last ice age. So those came about fairly recently in time, like the last 5,000 years. The other issue is our ancestors may not have had a sense of time for a very long time. And, evolutionary biologists who look backward in the archaeological record surmise that the only good evidence that our ancestors really could tell time in terms of I'm in the now and before now was before and there's going to be after later, that sense of being situated in a timeline, the only good evidence of that per the evolutionary biologists is burial rituals and art, because they surmise that a lot of art would have relied on creating a representation that situates the artist and the representation in time in a way. And also burial rituals are thought to only exist if our ancestors had a sense of time, because why would you do something special with a dead body if you did not have a concept of later, right? Well, you just wouldn't do it. So burial rituals and art show up in the archaeological record about 80,000 years ago. So basically, you've got 500 million years of a long span of time where brains basically always, 100% of the time, were mashing importance and urgency together, and only a very recent slice of time in the recent past where there were situations where it was appropriate to see something as very important but less urgent. So your brain, my brain, everybody's brains now, there is no natural wiring to see something as extremely urgent, extremely important, but not immediately assign it as extremely urgent at the same time, right? So basically, our brains are wired to say, I'm getting chased by a giant bear or the house is on fire, right? Now, why do I bring this up? I bring it up because we are more miserable when we have that kind of reaction than we need to be. Thus, there's unnecessary misery that could be abated if we could learn to parse out importance and urgency instead of keeping them mashed together and acting dependently together. If we separated and parsed them out and let them be independent, then we would be less stressed out and less subjectively miserable if something was very important, but we didn't simultaneously see it as necessarily at the same level of urgency. And we could say, okay, let me chill a bit. It's really important, but let me get to it as I can, right? Rather than flipping completely out, right? So we'd be less miserable. This is part of the rationale for sharing this. But the other is that we don't perform particularly well when we think the house is on fire. And I see this a lot when I talk to people, especially about interpersonal stress and how people are dealing with family issues, relationship issues, partner issues. And also when I do family therapy and when I do couples therapy, and I watch how people are reacting to each other, their brains are, in 1 millisecond to the next, reacting to each other as they're triggered by the other person, and that reaction is driven both by a fairly extreme sense of importance and extreme sense of urgency, right? I mean, think about it. You probably don't have to think back too far to think about a recent time where you got flipped out, triggered, and you reacted. And you probably would have reacted better had you waited a little bit, even seconds, let alone minutes and hours to react. And there's so many instances where if we just keep our mouth shut a little longer before we say something back to somebody in terms of interpersonal stress, or just in general, reacting to stress triggers without any sort of filter that takes into consideration urgency as a separate issue from importance, means that we're basically going to jump, right? So our brain is wired to say jump, 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 jump when we're triggered, because our brain is wired to basically see all threats as the same as being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. But we're not, Again, I mean, the comedian Louis C.K., he's problematic and controversial, I know, but he did have a skit where he did this monologue about wanting to reintroduce lions into the natural environment so that then people would actually have interesting stories about almost getting eaten by a lion and such. But his point is that natural selection has kind of stopped for human beings because people can do really stupid stuff and not get eaten by a lion, right? But that wasn't true for our ancestors, right? All the people hanging out with their ancestors who did slow, stupid stuff, they all got eaten by giant bears and such, which is why they didn't pass on the genes to chill out and wait. We got the neurotic genes, right? Which means ultra importance means ultra urgency, jump, right? So the practical piece of this is, if you can buy what I'm saying about importance and urgency not being the same things, even though our brain wants to mash those together and pretend that they are, that means that you can get in the habit of introducing that into your perception and your reaction, so that over time you add that as a capacity that you have in dealing with stress. So basically, it's some version of asking yourself, when triggered, is the building on fire? Or can I keep my mouth shut? Can I wait to react? Right? And is it easy? No. Is it valuable? Certainly. It's really, really valuable. And this is one of the reasons, I'll tell you, why couples therapy often helps couples. And it's not because we therapists do something magic or something super helpful. Hopefully we are in a helpful mode, and hopefully we do offer some expertise that actually gives people new options to explore. But I'll tell you, one of the reasons that couples therapy actually helps couples, because it slows down their interaction. If a couple is at home, let's say, fighting, then that means, again, they're triggering each other and reacting to each other in milliseconds with that high importance, high urgency, I'm about to get eaten by a bear kind of mode. And that's why those interactions escalate. Exact same argument in my office with the couple sitting with me is going to happen slower because, one, people act a little more slowly when they're being watched by a therapist who's sitting 6 feet away. But also, I keep interrupting and slowing them down, timing out, and asking questions. So I'm actually imposing the lower moderate level of urgency kind of perception and reaction, even though obviously they may be triggering each other at high importance, right? So that what that translates to is the couple ends up not fighting as badly and in as toxic a manner, and not escalating as quickly, hopefully, because they're in my office and I have to deal with it. But the thing is that if we can get triggered but separate out urgency, and some of the time, we're not going to be perfect at it, but if some of the time we can slow down our reaction, especially for things where objectively they aren't as urgent, we're going to get less stressed out about them. So we have to objectively sometimes just actually think, is this really that urgent? Or am I just wanting to jump and resolve this because I'm uncomfortable with the fact that it's not resolved? That's not objective urgency, right? For example, because I work with students in a college town sometimes, I'll have a student come in and say, I'm stressed out about my major. I need to choose a major. Well, if this is a freshman in their first semester of college, that's not that urgent compared with the same kind of presentation, a student telling me that who's like a second semester junior. Yeah, if you're second semester junior, maybe you need to see that as a bit more urgent at that point. But we assign high urgency to things that we also assign high importance. And so that's the takeaway for this video. And I'm always interested if you want to leave comments below. If you like this content, feel free to hit the like button, and feel very free to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this. Thanks.